So I'd like to thank you, the organizers, for putting together this glorious event. Wow, this table. I'm so excited that I get to be a part of this. So I'll get started. We should aim toward equity, not equality. This is a common refrain that one hears in the framing of debates about the distribution of material resources, especially, though, around questions of education. Everyone has seen the depiction of three people behind a fence. In the picture, well, imagine a lot of you have, these universal claims. So many of you have seen the depiction of three people behind a fence. So in the picture, often to the left, there are three people of different heights, one quite tall, one quite short, and one in the middle. And all of these people have been given a box upon which they are standing. The tall man, who had no trouble seeing initially, gets a boost he didn't need. The shortest of the bunch gets a boost, but still cannot see over the fence. The box only solves the problem of the middle person, who now can see over the fence. The picture supposedly represents equality. In the picture to the right, we see the same fence. Now the tallest of the three gets no box. The middle gets the same single box, and the shortest of the three gets two boxes. Now everyone can see over the fence. This picture depicts equity. Yet from the standpoint of many democratic theorists, there are serious problems with this depiction of equity as the champion for what it means to achieve a better, more fair, more vibrant world fit for robust human flourishing, like enjoying the baseball game, the reason everyone needed to see to begin with. Yet reducing equality to the notion that everybody gets the same thing and championing the idea that everyone gets what they need can't help us frame every question sets us up to frame every question of oppression and domination as a matter of the right allocation of material goods. This was Iris Marion Young's critique of the distributive paradigm of justice and the politics of difference. What about the social structure and institutional context that help determine distributive patterns? But even more, what about the social structure and institutional context that maintain inequalities that cannot even come into view if we are focused on material goods? There were various other depictions of the basic situation that frame the shortcomings of so-called equality in favor of equity, that revealed the limitations of equity as a frame. So in one, the fence that was a privacy fence, impossible to see through, becomes a wire fence. No one needs boxes anymore. Everyone can simply see through the fence. This picture is said to depict structural change. In another, the three people are shown tearing down the original privacy fence. This picture is said to depict liberation. But in this picture of liberation, the baseball game has disappeared from the example. And I wonder, what was the point of the fence to begin with? Its presence served a function, had a purpose, no? But what these alternative depictions do is get us to think about the structure and institutions. And when we do this, perhaps equality is more helpful than is often thought, and perhaps not in its capacity to give us definitive answers, but to delineate the problem space that we wade in when we care about equality and the concepts for which it is related. So for instance, in studying While Black, Trust, Distrust, and Opportunity, Sally Hassinger calls us to examine the Black-white achievement gap in education by not charting how one's race and class is linked to differential access to resources and opportunities, which that is the case too, but by investigating how individuals and institutions actually create race. The first approach to the achievement gap, she says, often takes race as given or explains the persistence of racial injustice as a result of our racist past, which has produced material inequalities and conscious and unconscious individual biases. While the first approach keys us into the ways that material inequality and conscious and unconscious biases are a part of our current circumstances of racial injustice, she also argues that this approach allows people to, quote, evade their own contribution to the social realities of race, end quote. When one examines how individuals in current operating institutions create race, Hassinger suggests that a different problem emerges. Take, for instance, Hassinger's discussion of an incident that occurs in a 10th grade honor Spanish class between two Black male teenagers and their white teacher. Jonathan notices that his teacher picks on his friend Mustafa, who is also Egyptian. One day during a class discussion about life in Chile, Mustafa asked the teacher whether women are able to go about Chile freely without being restricted to the home. The teacher's response to the question is that Chile's culture is not like Mustafa's culture. Mustafa tells the teacher she is mistaken about Egyptian culture. Women are allowed to go about freely. When the teacher challenges Mustafa the second time, Mustafa reacts with indignant disbelief, and in response, the teacher sends him to the principal's office. Now, Hassinger tells this story to illustrate how the persistence of racial injustice is not just a matter of individual or institutional intentions, but due to the fact that our day-to-day interactions have social meaning. That is, she explains, quote, "What we do in a context is not simply a matter of intention, but is partly determined by the meanings that are in the background in that context." The social meaning operative in this case, according to Hassinger, is the wide-scale devaluation of the knowledge of non-white men that reinforce the dominant culture's emphasis on the disruptive potential of males of color over their academic potential. Hassinger claims that even if the teacher does not believe this herself and she does not intend to imply these social meanings with her behavior towards Mustafa, that her actions still convey these meanings, as is evidenced by the impact this scene has on Jonathan. Now, Hassinger reports that Jonathan emotionally withdraws from the class for the rest of the year because the way his teacher treats his friends results in his inability to trust her as a legitimate authority figure. So Hassinger also argues that because the social meaning of an event is determined by the background context that no one person has control over, more conscientious individual response will not suffice to stop one's role in the creation of race in this way. Hassinger is right about this only if by a more conscientious individual response, we mean having the right racial attitude. But if by more conscientious individual response, we mean that the teacher should give account of her decision to throw Mustafa out of the class, because it seems to Mustafa and Jonathan that the teacher at the very least made erroneous stereotypical assumptions about Mustafa's culture, and when called on it, misused her power to retaliate rather than humble herself and acknowledge her mistake. And if it is found that she misused her power to avoid the humility that she owed, not only to Mustafa and Jonathan, but her entire class, then she should be held accountable for this failure. And if we fail to hold her accountable for abusing her power and fulfilling her duty as an authority figure in the classroom, we too, especially the authority figures in the school, are contributing to racial injustice through inaction and acceding to anti-Black racial meaning. How might we imagine the institutional and structural arrangements that would help us address the arbitrary will enacted against the racially dominated? To ponder this, let's join a conversation between democratic theorists and neo-Republicans about the status of democracy in achieving freedom. Democratic theorists challenge the neo-Republican claim that negative freedom, understood as freedom as non-domination, is the only principle one needs to protect citizens from the arbitrary will of fellow citizens, and even the state. Protecting citizens from domination, they would argue, also requires positive freedom, the experience of equal political power that can only be secured through democracy. Neo-Republican theorists counter that democracy is ordinarily understood as a form of government controlled and ruled by the people is too volatile and knee-jerk in reaction, too prone to manipulation, and too vulnerable to manipulation to be an essential pillar of freedom as non-domination. From this vantage point, democracy is a means to secure the neo-Republican ideal of negative freedom, but only if citizens are protected from democracy's defects, namely, the ways in which democratic decision-making institutions produce partisans and partial opinions that subvert the general interest of all, or the common good, from crystallizing and ruling. This means, according to Pettit, that the Republican state should be democratic, but in a way that supports an empire of laws, that disperses power across individuals and governmental bodies, and has in place counter-majoritarian measures to protect the more basic and important laws. Such a democracy does not derive its legitimacy through electoral authorization or majority rule, but through the people's power to contest and resist. A contestatory democracy achieves this by limiting the impact of electoral politics and irrational, tyrannical public opinions on decisions by instituting rational, impartial, deliberative bodies guided by the general interest, not particular ones. The ideal representative body is envisioned along these lines. It is inclusive by design, filled with representatives who act not as deputies under instruction from their constituents, but as people charged to deliberate with the interest of the citizenry at heart. However, just as much as freedom as non-domination relies upon an empire of laws and good Republican democratic institutions, these are not sufficient. Pettit writes, quote, "If the laws of the state are to be truly effective, those laws will have to work in synergy with norms that are established or that come to be established in the realm of civil society." Now, civil society performs a regulatory function that is distinct from, though intermingled with, the regulatory function of the state. When civil norms support the law, laws, quote, "will reliably attract compliance," end quote. When civil norms are out of step with the law, offenses that violate a person's right to freedom as non-domination may not register as such amongst others and go on unrecognized and unaddressed. In the former case, the civil norms emanating from civil society, Pettit says, should be recognized as habits of civic virtue or civility. He writes, "Suppose that there is some type of offense against people's freedom as non-domination, which is not generally recognized as an offense. Suppose, for example, that while some forms of government activity does not attract the interests or ideas of a particular group in the society, this is not established as a fact with the culture. In such a case, it will be possible to get the offense recognized only if there are people in that group, or at least people identified with the group, who are prepared to act in the group's name. They do not just complain on their own behalf, they display a form of civility which leads them to work at organizing the group and articulating shared grievances." And he concludes, "If things have changed for the better so that truly objectionable utterances and activities have been subject to formal or informal sanction, then that is the effect of civility in a more creative role than that which is associated with obedience to the law," end quote. Yet, the contestatory process that Pettit says protects citizens from domination, especially in instances where civic vices are the root of the problem, seems poised to exacerbate rather than resolve the tension between law and civil society if civic norms are out of step with the laws. To ensure that citizens can credibly challenge decisions, especially in instances where popular debate would make it impossible to give a minority opinion a credible hearing, Pettit argues that democracy requires recourse to formal bureaucratic inquiry, or the standing appeals board, or the quasi-judicial tribunal, or the autonomous professionalized body. If the decision coming from these rational, impartial bodies are at odds with civic norms, then it is clear how contestatory civility supplants civic vices with civic virtues. Are these formal bodies that protect minorities from tyrannical majorities reasserting laws that stand in tension with the civil norms that are needed to fortify the law on his account? And even with the affirmation of the law, is it still weakened because civil norms are at odds with it? How do the habits of civic virtue displayed by those who contest translate into wide-scale reform of civic norms in civil society? Pettit's view of contestatory democracy and the Republican institutions that make freedom as non-domination possible for citizens presupposes that citizens are committed to equality, whereas democratic theorists who insist that self-government is about giving citizens the opportunity to share in equal power figure political equality as a democratic achievement, not to be taken for granted. Nadia Urbanati suggests that political equality requires a, quote, "process of opinion and will formation in which citizens participate as equals in rights," end quote. This is the positive freedom that democracy delivers. Yet the contestatory democracy Pettit calls for, over and against the traditional populist majoritarian democracy, she thinks mischaracterizes what the ancients meant when they spoke of democratic self-government, and in so doing is unable to acknowledge and fails to deliver the resources that democracy as self-government has to keep its defects in check. Democracy properly construed is not simply majority rule, but a complex constitutional government, quote, "in which the citizens rule and are ruled in turn," and, end quote, and is respectful of each citizen's vote and sensitive to minority views. It is the case, though, that the political process by which political liberty is secured often puts the common good in jeopardy by succumbing to the partial views and interests that democracy seems to encourage from its citizens. So if democracy goes too far in this direction, it yields to full-fledged populism or empowers tyrannical majorities or tyrannical elites or sectional interests. Either way, the vulnerabilities of democratic political practice seem to suggest that democracy is unable to guarantee decisions and policies that abide by the principles of equality and liberty. According to the critics of democracy from the inside, as Abdur-Rahman puts it, one ensures the achievement of the democratic principles of equality and liberty by cultivating depoliticized venues for decision-making and encouraging reason, dispassion, deliberation throughout the demos in order to deliver impartial democratic judgments that attend to the general interest of all. Yet Abdur-Rahman suggests that depoliticized strategies deny people the other side of freedom, equal political liberty, and all of the political resources it offers to combat the vulnerabilities of democracy. Also, Abdur-Rahman argues that the depoliticized strategies just don't work. They too are vulnerable to tyranny and populism. If one is interested in protecting a political body from such threats, she suggests one focuses on cultivating a citizen's sense of the general interest of all, not by getting them to be good, impartial judges, but by getting them to exercise good political judgment. As political judges and not judicial ones, democratic citizens are called to, quote, see their personal case through the lens of the general interest to make laws that are not a direct expression of their private will or preference, yet not wholly opposite or indifferent to them either, end quote. To deliver a political judgment, citizens must be exposed to and form their own opinions. And good political judgments are guided by the Constitution, not just a written document, but as, quote, an ethical document that lives in and throughout the ordinary life of the citizen. Political judgment guided by and in tune with the Constitution as an ethical document is a part of the solution democracy offers to combat its vulnerabilities. Democracy can shape civil norms just as much as these civil norms can shape democracy. The means by which democracy shapes civil norms is by shaping the opinions and will of the people as they exercise their political equality through democratic self-governance. What form should this democracy take? Can democracy in its representative form fulfill the positive condition of liberty as non-domination? Or must democracy really and truly be directly participatory in order to secure equality? Responsive representative government, on both Pettit and Abdur-Rahman's view, activates the citizen cultures necessary to hold their representatives accountable. There is no need for direct democracy. In fact, Pettit and Abdur-Rahman agree that direct democracy is inferior to representative democracy, but for different reasons. And I'll just outline what Pettit says about the promise of representative democracy. So direct democracy is infeasible on his account because it leads to inconsistency, and this means that one can't simply rely upon majority rule to determine law and make decisions. And in order to have consistency, you'll have to sort of have these deliberative, rational bodies. Overall, though, he says that if you put this in place, a culture of freedom in the domain of speech, association, and travel will occur. Overall, electoral institutions will force people to exercise their freedom in political action. In addition, elected representatives have every incentive to search out policies that are likely to go down well with voters. Electing voters have every incentive to scour both the policies proposed and the policies implemented to see how far they measure up to whatever metric they impose. Now, in the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt presents a hard-hitting critique of representative democracy while at the same time offering a sober defense of it. She is clear that though representative democracy in Western Europe was better than what succeeded it, totalitarian movements that gave rise to the Nazi regime and the political instability of Europe, representative democracy also had proven fertile ground for totalitarianism. Both of these insights had to be acknowledged for Arendt, or one would risk missing the lesson that the rise of totalitarianism would teach us about democracy. Its revelation that democratic freedom and democratic majorities were delicate and ever vulnerable under representative democracy. The vulnerability of democratic freedom under these conditions was straightforward. People could effectively use democratic freedoms to abolish the very existence of those freedoms. Yet the vulnerability of democratic freedom to this kind of abuse was just a symptom of a more complex problem, the vulnerability of democratic majorities. Prior to the rise and success of the totalitarian movements, Arendt says that this vulnerability had been shrouded by two prevalent misconceptions. Many had assumed, quote, that the people in its majority had taken an active part in government and that each individual was in sympathy with one's own or somebody else's party, end quote. Yet the totalitarian movements revealed that democratic majorities could just as easily be comprised of people who were truly indifferent toward, quote, the articulate and visible institutions and organizations of democracy. Also, many had assumed that the indifferent members of democracy were inconsequential to its governance. Yet the totalitarian movement revealed that, quote, democratic government had rested as much on the silent approbation and intolerance of the indifferent and inarticulate sections of the people as it had on concrete social, economic, and political structures. With the vulnerability of democratic majorities fully in the open, Arendt seeks to explain the source of both these vulnerabilities and how they were exploited in the case of Western Europe. The source of these democratic vulnerabilities, Arendt suggests, reside in the paradox of democratic freedom, that though, quote, democratic freedoms may be based on the equality of all citizens before the law, end quote, they actually, quote, acquire their meaning and function organically only where the citizens belong to and are represented by groups or form a social and political hierarchy. In other words, difference gave democratic freedom its meaning and enabled it to function organically on her account. Though representative democracy in Western Europe provided this difference, it did so on shaky ground. Difference was secured in Western Europe through its foremost social category, class. Not only was membership in the class, as Arendt reports, generally by birth and only extraordinary gifts or luck could change it, but it was also the basis upon which one was represented in government. Actual representatives constituted an educated elite trained to secure the interests of its class in politics. These circumstances premised citizens' connection to politics upon their class membership, while it also distanced them from actual politics and public affairs. Arendt writes, quote, the citizen never was directly confronted with public affairs or felt directly responsible for their conduct, end quote. The way class and representative democracy in Western Europe worked, Arendt suggests, prevented the growth of a citizenry that felt individually and personally responsible for the rule of the country, end quote. Despite the tenuous connection everyday citizens had to public affairs, the class system had at least anchored citizens, however loosely, to the collective political body by attaching citizens to limited group obligations and traditional attitudes towards government. However, these loose ties to the political body came completely undone once class-premised representative democracy came crashing down. Arendt attributes the collapse of representative democracy to the bourgeois double morality that set the tone for politics in Western Europe at the time, and the legitimate outrage and disgust citizens felt about the catastrophic outcomes of this politics. Arendt blames the bourgeoisie for instrumentalizing politics. They were bent on using all public institutions to secure their private interest, even at the expense of a public common good. It was the absolute incapacity of the kind of politics born of bourgeois double morality to attend to the common good, and the catastrophic economic conditions such policies produced that made representative democracy in Western Europe susceptible to the vulnerability of democratic majorities. Their transition from indifferent and neutral majorities to politically activated masses. So from this particular point in the story, since I only have less than 5 minutes now, Arendt sort of talks about the ways in which the mob, which is the honest, illegitimate bunch in this entire story that seizes on the ways in which the hypocrisy of the respectable society and classes are being revealed in the public sphere. And the reason why the mob, this honest, sort of really criminal mob, is so popular to the majorities on Arendt's view is because they're honest about how vile they are, whereas the bourgeoisie is sort of, perpetrating, for lack of a better word, right? And so So she sort of presents this entire judgment. And I think the moral of the story that she gives is that though the system is instrumentalized in sort of the hypocrisy of the people who are using the state machine to do its dirty work is put out in the open, once the system collapses, right, what you have left are these social ties that sort of bound the people together. And these social ties for European folks at that time are premised upon anti-Semitism. That's the sort of opinion that is wide scale, and that sort of links these people who are disconnected from the social political structure and is able to be leveraged as a kind of rule in order to organize these people in an open politics of domination. And so I tell this story to say that however we think about institutions and structures, and we think about, liberation, freedom, equality, all of this nexus of ideas that come together when we think about what it takes to flourish as human beings in relationship to each other, one of the things that we really have to take seriously are our means of opinion and will formation as people, right? So how can the idea of equality as a sort of the equal access to power, the equal use of power, thinking about equality as a particular kind of standing, a particular kind of accountability to others, how might that be sort of like a building block for imagining a world where human flourishing is actually possible? And so let's think about equality and what tools that it gives us for doing that kind of work. Thank you.